we're off. The corridor project has actually involved, it's probably been the most multidisciplinary project we've run at SMI. It's involved greater than 30 researchers, plus a team of individuals at the MMG side of things, and collaborators from the University of British Columbia. And it's been, to be honest, from my perspective, as the coordinator of the project, tremendous fun. Oh, what happened there? Where's my talk? I can see it on the screen. Oh, it just was. Anyway, yeah. Okay, thanks, Rick. I'm so glad you're in the room. So this here is a map of Canada, and we're located here in the Nunavut territory, northern Canada. The Izok corridor, Izok Lake mine site itself is right on the border of Nunavut and Northwest territories. And then the corridor project itself involves that site and another one further to the north, which is called High Lake, which isn't shown on this map. Those are High Lake and Izok Lake are two exceptionally high grade deposits. And, you know, there is potential if these ore bodies can go into production, that there will be significant benefits for the local communities as well. But this is a classic complex ore body. These deposits have been known about, these resources have been known about for a long time now, and MMG are only the latest in a whole line of custodians of those resources. So MMG came to us, having seen the complex ore body program that we've been running, and said, well, what can you do to unlock this resource for us moving into the future? And there is a lot of complexity across a range of technical and ESG challenges. The region itself, you can see from this photo, beautiful, pristine. I mentioned previously in an earlier talk, you know, there's a natural gut reflex that you don't want to go here and disrupt this. And if I'm feeling that as a mining professional, then of course we as an industry need to be super, super careful in an environment like this to make sure we get it absolutely right. And there's remote communities, as already mentioned, so the potential to bring benefits there, but also a number of challenges that exist around interactions with remote communities. Okay. So the vision of the project was to understand the challenges facing the project and provide innovative options to address those challenges and move the project towards economic viability. Now, the reason why that last point there is important is because in 2013, MMG commissioned or had delivered a feasibility study on the Izok corridor project, and the conclusion was it was, to be honest, massively infeasible. It was just not going to fly. And some of the reasons for that were the infrastructure demands to build a road to the region and out to port. And other reasons for it were the design, which, you know, was a classic off-the-shelf processing design. So MMG came to us and we worked with them and put together a series of objectives for the project, which are listed here. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk, there's going to be a lot of information thrown at you, and I'm not going to talk to a lot of the slides. I just want to give really a shallow, high-level introduction to what the project was about. Give you a flavor for it before we go to the panel to really explore some questions in more depth. But as I said, there was a lot of researchers involved, and these were the themes that the project was really addressing. You know, themes to do with community, holistic assessment of the ESG factors. Water is a huge challenge up there, which I'll touch on in a minute. Can we apply novel technologies for the extraction of metals? Can we produce the metals with less energy and in a safer way? And so on. And we involved all 6 centers from SMI, apart from SMI Chile. And we had collaboration with the BRIM Institute over in the UBC. And this was the progression of the project. We started in February, and we ended up closing actually in October because there was a small delay from on the MMG side. They had to put the final workshop back. And we went through a series of, we ran a series of sub-projects effectively in the areas of water and equity, risk, processing, ESG, conservation. And you can see how that played out through the year. It really was a game of two halves. One of the really interesting ways of structuring this project was it was quite dynamic. So we started out with a broad scope, and the idea is we put forward some initial high-level reviews of the challenges that the project was facing, and then some potential ideas of how MMG may move forward. And MMG then assessed those ideas, and in a workshop in May, they then decided which aspects of the project they wanted to see investigated in further detail. So it was quite dynamic and an unusual way of structuring a project for SMI, but I really like that flexibility to it. So just quickly to touch on some of the work we did, we looked at processing, and the next few slides we'll be focusing on the processing side. And you can see that we basically brought to the table a whole bunch of ideas around pre-concentration, different ways of looking at bulk float, whether we can turn the project into something that was modular in the way it's built or mobile. And likewise, can we automate site and make it a remote site? Can we examine in more detail the energy supply? And should we look at the distribution of extraction of the resources? Would it make more sense to extract resource only from the Izok Lake mine as opposed to the Izok and High Lake mines together? So those are sort of the big impact ideas. There was a lot of ideas that the processing team threw out under the leadership of Lizette. And but those were the ones that we recognize would probably have the largest quantum of gain. And there was some fantastic thinking that took place within the processing team. They looked at a whole range of technologies, which you can see sort of mapped out here, everything from renewable hydrogen, energy storage, to blimps for transporting staff in and out of site, high voltage pulse, particle sorting. There was Marco even speculated for a while about whether it would make sense to use some kind of underwater mining techniques rather than draining the lakes that are present on site. And likewise, we looked at a bunch of environmental options or technologies that are expected to have a bigger impact in terms of environmental metrics on the ground. Because one thing that MMG were very concerned about is whether not only can we lower the CapEx and OpEx, but can we also make this a genuinely low footprint operation? And to sum everything up, there were we went through this approach here, which is listed on the left, looking at various scenarios, ranking them, running a value chain analysis. And then what was interesting is we handed all that information over to MMG, and internally in MMG, they did an economic valuation on it. And at the end of the day, there were roughly 8 priority scenarios which we handed over. And 3 of them look very promising, and 2 of them I've listed here as the most promising, which have a significant gain in terms of NPV. So we've gone from something that was significantly infeasible to something that is actually quite attractive to MMG on the ground. And the outcomes, new emergent technology having both economic and environmental impacts, making it much more feasible as a project. And Marcin looked at some of those 2 preferential scenarios in more detail and ran a mining value chain analysis on it, just to see what you could optimize and how you could play around with the different parameters in this project to really optimize the gains in terms of emissions and energy and water usage, and obviously CapEx, OpEx. Then in a second stage, in addition to Martin's energy analysis, we collaborated with UBC, who did a more granular, more detailed level energy analysis on the preferred scenarios that the processing team had come up with. And their approach was quite interesting. Ali Madisey was the key collaborator from UBC. And they put together what's called an energy profile for the project. And you can see this energy profile is running from when we think the project can start going into production to when we think it will end. And they look at Izok Lake and High Lake and the port, the Grays Bay port, and the energy usage in all those sites, if you like, in terms of total energy, electric power required, heat usage, what it costs in terms of putting trucks on the ground and so on. And then they pull the project apart and they really say, okay, well, if we're just using diesel, what does it look like? And then if we start to add in different renewable and alternative energy technologies, how can we make a difference to the financial and energy profile of the projects? And one of the outcomes of that analysis was actually a nice demonstration that if you do design the project from the beginning to be dominated by renewable energy sources, it has significant gains in terms, as you expect, in terms of emissions, but also in terms of economics. The cost of fuel and power generation is significantly lower. So that was very encouraging. On the water side of things, here's a photo, an image, I believe it is of the Izok Lake. I just actually had to capture this from the internet, so I haven't had it confirmed, but I think this was Izok when it was going through exploration. But the take-home message of this is, this is a lake, and they're actually going to have to drain this lake to start to produce the mine. And even just looking at that landscape, you can see from a water perspective how variable it is. There's an awful lot of variability in the ore. You've got bodies of open water which freeze during the winter. You have permafrost and so on. So incredibly complex water challenges in this region. At the same time, this is a region that's going through significant changes in terms of climate. I don't know if you realize it, but the Arctic domains unfortunately will undergo far more impacts in terms of climate change than latitudes that are nearer the equator. So everything, when we talk in terms of a 2 degrees C global warming, the impacts in the Izok region and northern Canada will be felt to a far greater degree. So that was all taken into account in our analysis, and Claire and her team did a fantastic job of reviewing what existing data existed, was present already, and making recommendations on what needed strengthening and how we needed to move forward in terms of interdependencies and feedback loops. And they also put forward some recommendations in terms of developing new technologies to make sure that in the future, you don't have to redo all your water quality assessments in order to be able to get the necessary permits and develop the mine or keep the mine management levels at an acceptable level. There are some systems level tools that you can develop which will enable you to be much more optimal in that and focused in terms of identifying the data sets that you need. On the conservation side, we were looking at wildlife and the impacts of the mine, particularly on caribou. But Lorna and Peter Erskine did a great job again of reviewing the existing wildlife data sets and producing what are known as habitat suitability maps for the caribou, but also assessing what data sets were missing there. So, they recognize that there's a few baseline updates required for certain wildlife, and that the considerations of how each species impacts on the environment and impacts on one another is a really important way moving forward. And there's a phenomenon known as trophic train, which if you're ever interested in this, I recommend you go to YouTube and you Google how wolves changed a river. And it's a story of how introducing wolves back into Yellowstone National Park actually stabilized the river systems in that park. And it's fascinating how species impact on one another and ultimately impact on the environment. The good news story here was in terms of caribou, which are a very important sensitive species in that region because of the how the indigenous communities rely on them and so on. The mine site itself, this is the project site for Izok. The mine site is in fairly low risk regions, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done here. And just moving towards the end of the overview, we also did a lot of work on risk itself. The ESG analysis that Eleanor very nicely talked about earlier this morning was also an aspect of this Izok project. And here are her results for Izok Lake, and you can see that she has compared Izok and High Lake, their rankings, their total ESG risk indices, if you like, against various peer groups, which are these box and whisker plots here. And I mean, clearly, the High Lake and Izok Lake, in some ways, no surprise, they sit right at the extremes of existing peer group distributions in terms of risk. And that's on a regional scale. We also looked at risks on the project scale, and we applied a completely new technique which Ben Seligman from MISC has developed, which is a network approach. It's a graph theory approach to risk. And the reason why I like this is because it can take a risk register, which normally has thousands and thousands of lines in a spreadsheet, and it can show you how they all link together. And it can show you that linkage in a map, such as this, these nodes and links that are shown on the right. And that shape of the map has information in it, and the color of the map has information in it. And then from that, you can begin to quantify what the really important risks are and whether you can mitigate the risks in a project very easily or whether the project has to be well managed across the board. And what was interesting about this project is it is genuinely a complex ore body. There's an awful lot, because of the unusual location we're in and the scenarios we suggested with novel technology, there's an awful lot of risks that come into the top sort of 30 events, which are quite unique around, you know, how you implement novel technology, what the implications are for people traveling on the roads in remote locations and for their mental health, wildlife vehicle interactions and so on. So all of that just to say effectively that the risk analysis confirms that this really is a complex ore body. And Izok Lake, High Lake as a project is more exposed than its peers. And that ranges, those risks come from a large range of factors, and you can't really just address one factor to de-risk a project. You are going to have to be, as Ben said, generally awesome, not just specifically awesome. But there's good news in that we all know that MMG have some good, some exemplary performance in managing social, environmental risks, and that is going to be key for the future. So we end up, of course, there's lots of recommendations, and I'm not going to read through those. The point is, we're able to deliver a number of recommendations to MMG, which are can be immediately acted upon. And I stole this slide as a conclusion slide from Rick, which is really a summary of the project, a really nice visual infographic of the project in some terms of, it's a project that has stretched across a large range of expertise areas that exist in SMI. It has linked them together. There's been a series of outcomes for MMG in the areas of understanding social context and water and equity and so on, which has been really well received and